Okay, that was 1 minute. Okay, so so glad that you're here today. I want to welcome you to today's Free Enterprise Forum, sponsored by the Ball Center for Entrepreneurship and Free Enterprise here in the Hankamer School of Business at Baylor University. My name is Patrik. I'm chair of the Department of Entrepreneurship and Corporate Innovation, as well as the academic director of the Free Enterprise Speaker Series. I'm really delighted that we have a special guest with us today, Patrik Schumacher, and we'll get him started in just a moment. Let me tell you a little bit about our event. The Free Enterprise Forum is a distinguished lecture series bringing prominent academics and policymakers and journalists and other voices to campus, sometimes virtually, sometimes in person, to speak to faculty, staff, and students about important issues related to the nature and operations of a competitive free enterprise system. We're very interested in the business school and, of course, at Baylor and in our entrepreneurship and free enterprise program on the nature of a market economy and how it contributes to things like economic growth and overall societal well-being. As a lot of you know, entrepreneurship has been a signature area at Baylor since the 1970s. One of the top ranked, well, I'll go ahead and say it, the top ranked undergraduate program at Baylor is the entrepreneurship program. If you saw the US News rankings that came out a couple of weeks ago, highlighted by President Livingstone. We also are very strong in entrepreneurship research. Our research faculty were recently rated on one index as the as the fourth most productive entrepreneurship research group in the entire world. So that's quite wonderful. We're very interested in creativity, novelty, and innovation, often in an entrepreneurial context, but more broadly as these things impact society. So it's my pleasure to have Patrik Schumacher deliver this lecture for us today. Patrik is the principal of Zaha Hadid Architects. He's one of the most influential thinkers, speakers, writers, and actors in the design world. I know we have a lot of visitors from interior design and from fine arts today, and I'm sure you guys are very familiar with the buildings, with his buildings. Zaha Hadid's work and Patrik's contributions in particular. He's known for really visually striking buildings with a unique, organic, flowing design. I'm hoping maybe he'll show us some samples of projects he's working on today. But Patrik is also an accomplished theorist, speaker, and writer on issues related to art and design and urban planning and broader themes in society as well. So, I met Patrik several years ago at a conference, and last year I came across an article that he wrote, published in 2024, called "The End of Architecture," published in an academic journal. And he argued in that paper that, quote, "architecture as an autonomous theory-led discipline has ceased to exist." That was the tagline of the article. And I'll just quote a few words from the abstract without stealing too much of this thunder. Patrik says in that article, "Once defined by rigorous critical discourse, architectural innovation, and theoretical grounding, architecture has devolved into a fragmented practice now operating on the level of a mere craft rather than a science-based academic discipline and profession. Academic institutions, biennals, and other professional critique have abandoned their roles as incubators of architectural thought, instead engaging with tangential socio-political issues that stray from architecture's core competency." So I said, we got to get this guy to come and give a talk to our students. And Patrik's going to address those issues today, put them in a broader context, and especially relate ideas about design and creativity more broadly to things, to issues of entrepreneurial, business, and technological innovation and creativity as well. Patrik holds a degree in architecture from the University of Stuttgart from 1990. In 1999, he completed a PhD in cultural studies at the University of Klagenfurt. He's a co-founder of the Design Research Laboratory at the Architectural Association of London. And he's been a member of the Berlin Academy of Arts since 2014. He taught a class with Zaha Hadid at the University of Applied Arts in Vienna for many years. He's also taught at Harvard and at Tongji University in Shanghai, China. He holds an honorary doctorate from Francisco Marroquin University in Guatemala. Patrik has published 2 books and over 100 academic articles. He's received academic and professional articles on architecture and design and urban planning. He's received many awards for his design work, and of course, most importantly, his signature works are in cities all across the world. So please join me in welcoming Patrik Schumacher to Baylor.
Great, thanks, Peter. I hope everybody can hear me. So,
can you guys hear?
Great. So this will be a very informal, chatty talk. Interrupt me any times, or Peter kind of prompt me with questions. I thought, so my title is The End of Architecture, the woke takeover of the discipline and profession chokes off creativity and progress in architecture, referring to that article. I thought I'd start just to show a few images of what we've been doing and what innovation in architecture might look like. And then to contrast this to how architecture actually has stalled, and what I'm showing you here is a drop in the ocean of an otherwise kind of stagnant and stalled development. So can I share my screen for a few minutes?
Yes, you should be able to share.
Okay, let me try that.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay. So it's just to give a bit of a visual flavor. I'm not going to explain a lot. 1 second. Okay, yeah. Is that now slide by slide?
Perfect. Yes, there you go. We can see it.
Okay, architecture for the 21st century. So Zaha Architects started in the 80s, and we've been developing and researching and innovating in the 90s, but the takeoff was only at the end of the 90s and early 2000s, where we really suddenly started to proliferate our works across the globe, and we also swept up with that huge boom and then bust up to 2008. So we've just showing a few glimpses. We're going across all continents, all typologies. We start a lot with major cultural buildings, but also mixed-use complexes, bridges, sports buildings, research centers, museums. There's a few things we dropped off also in America. There's in Michigan State University Museum in Lansing at the bottom here, the National Museum in Rome, Maxi, a glimpse of a project in Saudi Arabia. This is an important flagship for us. It's in the center of Beijing. It's a mixed-use complex where I want to show how we could operate on scale with a 3-dimensional public space connected with bridges and internally hollowed out by atria. So it is a maximized communication. These are mostly office spaces and a lot of co-working, as well as a lot of facilities to meet, eat. A lot of the food and beverage is the retail zones, to have a kind of, let's say, innovation hub for startup companies and smaller companies in China. And this was part of this huge wave of Chinese development, where we had, for the same client, we generated 4 big projects. And there's a few other glimpses. This is in Saudi Arabia, and you can see the kind of atria and field spaces, connective tissues, and communication spaces. That's our specialty. The things look unusual and iconic is because we have a very rigorous process of optimizing for structure, optimizing for connectivity, and having these themes of atria and bridges, and not having the structure in the way of communication. This is a major flagship in Beijing. We recently done airports. This is a new airport in Beijing. We're opening actually on Wednesday with Prime Minister Modi, new Mumbai airport. Earlier this year, we've opened in Australia, the Sydney second airport. So, but this is a major project in Seoul. 17 million visitors per year, on as much as the Louvre nearly. And we have, cultural complexes. Again, you see China, Asia, Middle East. That's where things are moving and happening. This is in Morocco, Rabat, more in China, cultural complexes, etc., libraries. And this is actually we're also exploring Central Asia. There's a new Tashkent in Uzbekistan. Ambitious projects, landmark projects where countries who are developing want to also make a statement, but also have really hub spaces where an emergent knowledge economy is in research center and exhibition space. They have these spaces to put themselves on the map and host great events. So these are the kind of buildings we're doing. So this also operates on the city scale, but I want to kind of stop that. This is just a little bit of an illustration what innovation looks like, and this work evolved, as I said, actually started with Zaha in the 80s. I joined in the late 80s and it was a very, very small studio, but there was a whole movement emerging of avant-garde architects, studios connecting up with universities. I started to teach as well in the mid-90s then, and earlier at Columbia University, Harvard already with Zaha. So this is a culture of experimentation, of innovation, and basically an attempt throughout the 90s to develop a new paradigm for architecture, which was aligning with a socioeconomic transformation, and for me, very consciously, for a lot of my colleagues, intuitively, what I call the post-Fordist restructuring. So basically what we've seen is the introduction of computational revolution, microelectronic revolution, telecommunication revolution, globalization, and this kind of step shift away from mechanical mass production of endless repeated individual, let's say, copies of millions of generating the same product, into having economies of scope, not only scale, and having fast innovation cycles, because you can reprogram the robots, you have flexible visualization, you can 3D print. Then when software service came up, you can absorb an enormous amount of innovation in these new technologies, basically, upload a new app every week, every day to billions of people, and therefore most people shift away from the assembly line, which are now kind of only robots, and you have only technology workers and innovators on the shop floor if at all. And same as agriculture. We have R&D centers and biotech centers, and we have agriculture with very, very few people, and a tractor is now a robot. Robots who are scanning the soil and calibrating water and fertilizer, etc., and seeding. So that world, I call it post-Fordist network society, because we're moving to this flexible specialization and computationally empowered civilization, which is very, very different from the era of up to the, let's say, 60s, 70s. And that also what brought communism down. And that brought on, I think, a huge kind of necessity, and much increased necessity, of reliberalizing the economy. So that's why you have Thatcher and Reagan revolutions, because this era of mechanical mass production, where you have a handful of commodities which are rolled out unchanged for decades to millions and millions of people, that nearly generates a kind of physical equalization, and it's easy to plan, relatively speaking. I mean, it's still inferior to market processes, but all the capitalist world was kind of socializing, nationalizing, regulating, similar to the communist world. So all of that, the communist world went down because it couldn't compete at all and pick up these new dynamics which were necessary. And it's also to do with the convergence to urban centers, like the urban renaissance, and what we now often is called the knowledge economy is the same. But as I said, the absorption capacity of these new technical system technologies for innovation is infinite, because you can reprogram the robots, you can produce through 3D printing, which we're doing as well now, mass market, tailor products, small runs, economies of scope. And that is what this architecture is adapting to. Also, this new densification into urban centers. Before, in the 20th century, this rolling out into the greenfield factories, greenfield sleeping cities, everybody 9 to 5 commuting to the assembly line and back, or whether it's an administrative assembly line or public sector work. So that world has totally changed. And it was, of course, in retrospect, incredibly stifling, boring. And now we are all kind of knowledge workers, and we no distinction between learning, working, entertainment, infotainment, continuous learning, and collaborating on a global scale. So in our company, we have 500 people from 60 countries, and we are exporting globally. Now, the thing is that there were glimpses of this evolving and this kind of architecture coming through, and it was electrifying a whole generation of architects throughout the 90s into the early 2000s, until we hit the 2008 crash, and people had so much work. It was these kind of boom developments in the Middle East. China was rolling, Europe, all these new countries, relatively new countries in Europe and the EU, Spain, particular, Greece and others. This was partly an artificial boom-bust cycle, but it brought on enormous energy. And with 2008, it came to some kind of halt, and we had, Occupy Wall Street, and we had a backlash and back to basics. And there was a shift in the mentality, and of course also in the architecture schools, where there wasn't this prospect of learning and designing and hoping to open up a new studio and join the kind of transformational rush. And so there since then it's been a kind of a retrenchment and a gradual kind of shifting away. Of course, there was a core group of innovators and creatives who kept going, like who were keep growing and elaborating. There were some markets like China and the Middle East were opening, and we had also Australia opening, and starting to move in India. So for us, it is working in the Western world, in particular in Europe. Opportunities closed down and mentalities closed down. And you all know this huge kind of wave of woke concerns, which infected the architectural discipline quite a lot. You can imagine also that in architecture you deal with traditionally you have social concerns in any event. You have issues like social housing. So there was always a kind of a relatively sympathy with and a quasi-socialist mentality in the architecture profession, which kind of temporarily got kind of in this kind of neoliberal exuberance, got kind of onto the back burner, and then kind of came back with a vengeance. But it came back to such an extent that the actual ongoing developments, which we were kind of still making, whether it's in Europe, in London, in around the world, had kind of been thought of as fallen, of neoliberal, as commercial, as capitalism. There was a lot of wave of anti-capitalism kind of spreading, of course, throughout Western Europe in particular, and in the architecture schools, it had a latent kind of left-leaning attitude to some extent that came in with the vengeance, and it led in a way to getting no longer believing in development of urban centers. We are working on the frontier of the most advanced arenas. We think that we have some kind of trickle-down theory of you can only do the next stage of development in the major cities where there's investment, where there's convergence and densification, and the high-value productive centers and companies and corporations. I was particularly interested in the corporate design, campuses for firms like Google and Facebook. And we wish we had more of such companies in England, but we had the financial sector, and we have these companies. That's why I think we need, where you can expect the most advanced architecture to go first. These are the early adopters who help financing, refining, and innovating further the, let's say, the potential of the civilization. And this was looked at in the discipline, both on the academic front, most of the teachers, but also the biennales and cultural communicators and magazines. They all pulled away from this and started to say, you know, focusing on marginal groups, on social justice issue, community inclusion issues, maybe looking at studying slum conditions in the developing world, political issues. It was highly politicized, and kind of social justice agendas were swamping nearly everything in all the major elite schools, particularly starting with elite schools, starting with Harvard, Columbia, and then also where I'm teaching at the Architectural Association School. It's also in Europe. They became very, very strong. And in a way, meaning the end result of this, that of course development was still occurring, although on a smaller scale, but it wasn't looked at as being meaningful, as being interesting. This was just kind of money grabbing and so on. So that led to the way what we still were doing. We were basically critical discourse, and the platforms in which we wanted to show and discuss these works were withdrawn. So, and also rarely invited for lectures. The exhibition spaces in these schools and at the biennales and in the museums, we're not kind of brought in, we're not drawn in anymore. And other small studios or third world, or let's say developing world figures became kind of prominent. But that meant in the actual development, the bulk of the urban development and architectural process was, in a sense, cut loose, bereft of any critical discourse and engagement. And that's why I say it became some kind of a craft, because we don't get critical feedback. We just go and keep doing what we're doing. And in terms of the professional discourse within the discipline, it shifted more and more to sustainability only. So there we also wouldn't discuss these kind of, let's say, innovative spatial concepts or urban densification with a new level, mixed uses overlapping and interpenetrating domains, or new typologies of live, work, or co-living. All these things which we are interested in, they have no forum of discussion. And I want to throw in as well how this thought about, this is not only within these cultural discourses, but it's also because in the development of these cities, for instance, in England, but also in Europe, there was also this shift where they were interested to have some of our buildings in, let's say, the early 2000s in major cities. They wanted, cultural landmark buildings, museums, conference centers, opera houses, and that kind of shifted away. And everything became kind of more mute, modest, contextual, and the planners, there's an interfacing between, let's say, this kind of lack of innovation in the schools, a lack of interest, because also there's no longer an outlet in Europe in any event. Because in Europe now, in these mature cities, you can only do small interventions, modest. There's a lot of political backlash against any development. There's this big NIMBYism. That's why there's huge kind of development and housing crisis. So there's been more and more this shift into community engagement, inclusiveness, and basically making things very as small as possible. A lot of things get prevented altogether, and you can only succeed with the development if it's very polite and very modest and mute and inconspicuous and hardly noticeable. And anyway, you have the risk of rejection. So we nearly, although we kind of expanding around the world, we didn't have that much cachet recent years in Europe. So we have done we've tried, I mean, I'm German, we have got a few Germans, we've tried about 150 competitions in the last 10 years in Germany, winning nothing. We used to be Italy, similar, a lot of the European countries. We get more chance in Eastern Europe. They have more some kind of energy yet and catch up growth mentality. So we get somewhere in the, into the Eastern European new countries, but we have nothing in the Western heartlands. And and I can now think also, if you think about it, why in the schools of architecture, if you somehow realize that what we're trying to develop here will never land in the major Western countries, that this is disheartening and discouraging the students and also the critics. We are misunderstood as being kind of self-indulgent, exuberant, superficial. Although, you know, when you look at my writings and books and the discourses we have in that internal group, there's a lot of intelligence and you know, optimization logics, not only technical optimization but social functionality optimization. We are developing agent-based simulations of occupancy patterns, interaction patterns to optimize for the knowledge economy. So we have built up a lot of intelligence, and it's premised, and you could use some of this also with the simplistic volumes and stereotypical forms of development, which at the moment are the only ones which have any chance to succeed in the Western Europe. But somehow that is also not absorbed, because you get to something where, and I want to make this, that is really also stifling the creativity in the development of Western Europe, and in London it's very, very strong, is that the developers who should be the urban entrepreneurs who are bringing, maybe should be able to bring sites to life, select sites with the vision of what would enhance a city district and value potential at that point. They don't have that option. There's only very few sites available, and they're coming 100% prescribed with respect to what should be built there and how this should look like by the planner. So that we have a very, very strong central planning really taking over totally the final product. So they're prescribing land use. So exactly how much retail, office, residential, they're prescribing the overall density and volume. They have rules of not overlooking between that and height restrictions. And then they're going in and prescribing exactly the unit mix for the residential, for instance. They're the most restrictive. And they tell you how many 4-bedroom, how many 3-bedroom, how many 2-bedroom, how many, and they like more the large, want to privilege larger families, which the market doesn't really need. And they're going in and prescribing every size of every room with minimal standards and equipment to, so there's 100% prescribed, and there's usually prescribed in a way that it's over delivering for most of the market, except there's a very high end luxury market, which still existed for a while, and not so much. So they're kind of, the developer comes in and basically has to exactly build this, and then he has to negotiate through cross-financing social housing infrastructure. So it's a very strange system where they then have to kind of play up to the planners, and they're only competing basically on rent, let's say, gaming the system. So it's a gameable discretionary system where they spend a lot of time and have high risk, and only large companies can do, and only highly localized companies can do it. And they then would see that can guess the chances that they can reduce the social housing component or get away with you know, a bit more area here or there. And that is super stifling. So they cannot actually innovate on the product. And sometimes, occasionally, there's a loophole. There was a young entrepreneur in late 20s who developed a co-living concept, something totally different, with very, very small units, shared space on each floor, free co-working, lecture space. Was a kind of a startup community thing with 500 people, and used that loophole of house of multiple occupancy, which is usually kind of 4 or 5 people, which are not strictly speaking a household, sharing a house. And he did this with 500. I don't know how he got through this. There was a lot of excitement about it. We met them. We developed a number of schemes. And then the planners kept refusing any further of these developments, and finally came around with maybe allowing this, but then only prescribing exactly, again, how many of these amenities you have to put in, and prescribing that you have to change bed sheets. So it is this kind of over politicized overregulation and largely also huge amounts of poor prevention, I think is, first of all, it's terrible for the development of you lack urban. You can't build these synergy centers and hubs anymore to the full extent because people can't move into London anymore. It's super expensive. They have to then maybe go to Birmingham or somewhere else or commute for 2 hours. There's also a green belt which contains randomly and arbitrarily, so they have to then jump over the green belt and commute further, or live in, like a lot of my people, at the age of, where they usually should have been able to buy a house, at the age of, in their early 30s, they live in bedsits or share flats and share toilets and crappy places to be close, to be in the center. So there's a total freezing out of supply. And more recently, this supply has further crashed because of there was a fire somewhere and that wanted to put new regulations and it paralyzed everybody because the regulations weren't clear. So you have absolute planning paralysis. And of course, this feeds back into the whole profession. If you can work in China, maybe in those parts of the US which are still kind of more open, like Texas or maybe LA, then it's disheartening for your innovation. And you just think like this. That's why the Vogue also kind of, in the meantime, has infiltrated into the planners. So to some extent, it is actually meaningful for the students to learn these subtleties of catering for that. But I think it's highly, highly stifling and problematic. And so we love to sit in London with 500 people. And we have some offices in China, Hong Kong, Beijing, Shenzhen, a few small satellites like in Berlin, Madrid, and Copenhagen to cater for the kind of North and East Europe. But it's very, very stifling on the creativity, and there's very few companies who, and we would love to. We have a lot of ideas of innovating. Also on the planning side, private planning. I mean, London was built by private planning. So, because in planning, to some extent, you need to curate a value proposition. You could have value destructions if you totally deregulate. Although with industry being out, I don't think that's much of an issue anymore. So I do believe in value curation, and I also believe in total freedom of co-location synergies. So you need a lot of entrepreneurial freedom so that these networks find each other and the space is utilized to its most highest potential. And if you have planned prescriptions, that can't happen, and you have a lot of falsely labeled or prescribed land uses. So you have two plots next to each other. One is the land is 4 times more expensive than the other because this has a planning for residential and this has a planning for only, for instance, office space. And that shows you the massive value destruction and distortion. So there's a bit of an economic argument, but it also, as I said, there's a kind of huge infringement of creativity, of innovation, of entrepreneurship for developers. And you cannot come in as an outsider as well. But it's a closed shop because if you don't know all the planners and the councillors, and you need to know both, you need to get green light both from the councillors and see what they and cater to their kind of predilections and hobby horses. But that is a necessary hurdle, but no guarantee. So you can be caught out. You've pleased all the councillors, they're willing to promote your project, and then you're facing a bureaucrat, the planner, who doesn't have to listen. They prohibit anyway. That happened to us. We have a project here in London which is 7 years in. In the meantime, we would have put it up 3 times in China. And the value destruction, and at the same time, everybody's crying out for these exponential growth in house prices and these kind of 4 million missing homes which are projected. But there seemed to be no possibility to, on the political front, to loosen that. Even the central government is trying sometimes. So the most, curiously, the most kind of, oftentimes the central government is trying desperately to carve in and break up or pull out a project, and from a mayor's perspective or even central central UK government on very large projects, they can step in and give permission. But then you can also imagine the whole woke thing, the outcry, no, but community and local engagement, you can't just override this, so they don't dare. And I can tell you that there will never be a single runway ever built in London or in the UK in the next 300 years. So, because they tried at Heathrow Airport for the last 40 years to put another runway in, and it simply won't happen. So that is a planning paralysis, and this is just is paralyzing everything. And I'm so glad that we don't depend on this market. I mean, we are working in a global market where you have open markets still. Of course, China, I have to say one more thing. China is slightly less open and entrepreneurial, of course, under Xi Jinping the last kind of 15 years, and it's getting worse. Everything is government owned, but it's still way up there compared to Western Europe. But it used to be much more open, much more private developers. They have been kicked out and shifted out and kind of clamped down. So it's also not great. And China has generally had a crisis recently, but thank God India has opened up, etc., etc. So we had many problems with political kind of interferences also in Australia when there was a lot of development there, and in the end the government kind of didn't like this. So that's what we're talking about. But overall, I feel this movement of what I call, just throw in a phrase, in parametricism, which is the urban architectural and designerly kind of epochal transformation of everything around design based on that computational and telecommunication revolution, which also is transforming all other industries. And we need to, in our response to that, we have to create a different city, and we also need to use those tools. And I tell you, everything which goes on, mostly what goes on in architecture doesn't need those tools really. And what goes on up now in London looks more regressive, more traditional, more contained and constrained than what was going up in the 60s and 70s. So we are actually putting up everywhere solutions which one-to-one could have been proposed 100 years ago. And that, I think, is quite sad. And there's a huge, I think, infringement on people's on prosperity for everybody, because if you're earning more, if you want what do you really want to flourish and deck out your life when you're earning a little bit more, you don't need another 3 cars or eat 10 steaks or fill your wardrobe with another 25 suits. Really on the level of rewarding, you want a larger, nicer space, better located, with maybe nicer outdoor spaces. I mean, that's where, but if that's not available or becomes astronomically and really the base of your life, so with young people can come to London and they can compromise but you can't compromise your whole life. They're spending 80% of their salary on a crappy flat share where the kitchen is always dirty by your flatmates and the toilets are not working. These are former actually social houses which have been converted into flat shares. I used to live like this, but I mean that's simply because these supply constraints are so large and the product is not freed up. So for instance, that co-living thing would be an answer. Very small units, 10 square meter, 12 square meter, 15 square meter, but the government is prescribing 49 square meter minimal and telling everybody this is not worthy for a human being to live in these rabbit hatches, therefore preventing them and pushing people in even worse rabbit hatches. And they're saying, okay, student housing, we allow for that, but only for students. And then, so if you're lucky enough to get a place and a spot in a nice central located student housing, once you're no longer a student, you have to descend into the hinterlands or into a crazy flat share, which and because the product isn't allowed through. And we would love to think through, we love to innovate on these various types of co-living and how small you can come and how much personal space you need, and be innovative. I mean, this is for entrepreneurs, in how do you make a density work for everybody? You need to, you can't say prescribe, if there's another window in the next 30 meter across, this prevents you from living here. And that's arbitrary, nonsensical prescription, which just make everything more expensive and density reduction. I say leave that to the market, of course, and leave that to us to figure out. Maybe I want to look into other people's rooms, and they can choose whether they want to be looked at or not. So there is it's really like it's another leaden paralysis, handcuffs for developers, for entrepreneurial developers. And I've recently talked to somebody in Austria, said, I'm giving up. I mean, the projects take forever. There's so much risk. Bye-bye, I'm going to Dubai. So you have, there, and he said, I've bought a land already, come work with me, and I have no restrictions, live your dream. And by the way, a lot of my staff moving to Dubai also. Zero tax, higher salary. There's another thing happening, and that is why Europe is dying. We have 0.5%, and I throw this one thing in, which is underestimated. Europe is growing 0.5%, and maybe per capita growth 0%. Anyway, if you had 0.5%, fine, and you're in America, you have 2.5. That's 5 times. You don't notice it in 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, but in 20 years, it's massive. If you grow, 3, 4%, which you could grow, and you say that in 10, 20 years, you doubled everything. Work, or even more, quadruple. Work half the time, more easygoing, and have everything double. Double space, double everything. And that's what we're going. The prosperity is cumulative. And it builds on synergies and I mean, so basically, if you live another 50 years, you can either live on this kind of slow cook of nothing much changing. If you compare how life changed and in some kind of takeoff periods and how little it changes now. I mean, in America, much better place than in Europe, but Europe is really kind of languishing and in a state of paralysis. And it was the driving engine for architecture together with the US. But all these US elite universities are in this kind of still, and in the, let's say, vogue kind of distraction. And when I put this article out, and people didn't think, I thought, okay, architecture is a technical issue. They were surprised. So I got invited to TV, television, radio, newspapers, because people couldn't quite imagine that architecture was kind of descending into this kind of vogue paralysis, also as a discipline. And so it was quite surprising to people to hear that. But I've witnessed this, and of course, I've witnessed it in Harvard for many, many years, where the whole school could be taken over by the Me Too thing, and nothing else is done. And then, of course, George Floyd thing was massive, but it was going on for longer. And so that's the sad situation. But I also see, of course, there was backlash against all of that. And there's been consciousness and awareness also here, and some of the political parties they've identified the planning as a huge problem. But the courage to bust that up is lacking. And I think that will only come if there is really a deep, deep crisis. When you really have descending and financial crisis or descent in a really decreasing standards of living, which was in a way London in the 70s when Thatcher came through. Thatcher came through in 79 against this whole kind of left kind of trend, because literally Britain was falling so far behind against other countries like Germany, which much were free markets still at that point. And you had massive inflation, 15, 16, 18%. You had, paralysis with trade unions. You have garbage piling up in the city. you had a 3 days of electricity, and it was just too much. And that I think that's what probably without that there won't be a kind of, without that the frog will be cooked to death, it's on slow burn. Anyway, I stop here and we can open
Thank you.
discussion.
Patrick, thank you very much. We do have time for questions from the audience, and those of you in the room, there are microphones in the ceiling, so if you just speak up, he should be able to hear your question. So we don't have a microphone, hand mic. Please, anything that you would like to ask for clarification on, or maybe to challenge something that you heard? We'd love to get opinions from students and maybe some professors too, but professors don't try to monopolize the conversation. While people are thinking, we have one. Oh yeah, where? Oh yeah, right here, please, sir. I think he won't be able to see you, but he can hear you.
It's okay. It's okay. You can.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you well, I think.
I was curious, what do you think the educational institutions should do to combat the governmental regulation? Because it seems like the government regulations is what is stifling creativity. So how do you want the education systems to combat that?
Well, I think it's a battle of ideas, and I think it needs more courage also for people to step up. I mean, I've been criticizing government policies for quite a few years, but when I first came out and starting to criticize a highly opaque and I feel unfair and dysfunctional subsidy system in the housing sector, I was, canceled basically, vilified, and I had literally demonstrations outside of my office, and posters with me with a Hitler mustache and so on. I was a fascist and so that's one thing. I mean, this has shifted. I think we're no longer in that space, and there's been more voices. So I think within the schools, within university, within public discourses, in the context of biennales, I've been also publishing and writing, and I get a lot of good resonance for that. We need to kind of bring forth these arguments and, obviously reject any personal attacks on us as being, brutal or self-serving. I mean, that as is characterized as somebody who's only interested in money, and I'm only working for the rich, and all sorts of defamations we have to kind of be tough about. And of course, if you're in business, that's not easy sometimes to suffer. So it's easier to do that in academia, maybe by now. But also, I think there's this kind of synergy. A lot of this originates in academia, and then the graduates move into the planning system and into the civil servant services. So there is kind of these echoes, and there is this kind of groupthink, and because of the discourse is moralizing, and it becomes one-sided easily, or it discourages open debate. That's what we felt, and I'm sure you've heard these kind of arguments many times, but it is also, it needs to be politically courageous putting forward, and this sometimes tough. I mean, for instance, in Britain, the planning restrictions, to break them open, there's so much prejudice, there's so much anti-capitalist sentiment, there's so much fear, and there's also the entrenched interests of the incumbent homeowners in the various local localities who always want to be on the side of, prevention, maybe instinctively that could compromise me, or that generates noise or this could compete with my house. I mean, there's this kind of unfortunate empowerment of what it collectivist community kind of decides on what happens, and to get away from this now when this is associated with democracy and empowerment, and there's been kind of endless repetition of these kind of notions, and we just say no, let's kind of roll this back. That's a very tough one. And even though you have think tanks, and I was with the Conservative Party, they knowing that this is a problem, that there's this paralysis, to really go at this problem within is very, very tough one. That's why I said, unfortunately, I believe it only has, when there's no other way forward, when you get the financial crisis, when you get literally degrowth, which you have in Germany, by the way, where there's that will kind of allow for new voices to come forward, unfortunately. But until then, anyway, we're trying. Let's join the battle of ideas. And there are, of course, rational and good thinkers also in the domain of critique of planning. I mean, a lot of people who've been studying this, they understand that, but there's a big gap between understanding that and talking about this in think tanks or in academic circles, and letting this become party program, and then not being suicidal for that party.
Thank you. Questions? Yes, please.
We have a lot of interior design, interior architecture students here. So I wonder if you could maybe just in the last few minutes that we have, just offer some encouragement to them about how they can be more creative and feel free in their designs and take some risks in that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think interior design is more unencumbered. Although, as I said, when it comes to residential in Europe, it's high, in particular, and it's very prescriptive there too, because all the number of rooms and sizes of rooms, and that you have a balcony of a minimum, so all of that. So you only have the styling left. It would be nice to work on typological kind of transformations. But of course, in residential is, you can go into what we love, and we love to work with with work environments or educational environments. And there's much more scope, particularly on the interior. The exterior is set by the political, but the interior could be really exciting, and you could really, have open, fluid, porous spaces, gradient transformation from one condition to another. We also have these depersonalized spaces, and I've been studying a lot of work environment. I find it fascinating. Knowledge economy, work environments, co-working, but also network organizations and corporate organizations. So we've been pitching for Google, Facebook, and we've been making studies for these companies. There you can do a lot. You can still do really exciting innovations, and also work with transformability. There's an insatiable need for flexibility, and we've been developing these robotic systems which optimize their own utilization by roaming around and and staying where they're utilized more. So I think there's still energy and an opportunity there. And for me, that's why I've been recently excited. I'm working on the metaverse now, because I think in terms of virtual spaces, a lot of interaction, particular collaboration, exhibition, cultural events. We have all our exhibition as digital twins we put them online as 3D environments. We're developing a metaverse called Metatopia. So a lot of that for architects and designers and interior designers, the metaverse is a huge project where you have much more degrees of freedom, and it's really totally market driven, and there's no regulation at play yet. And that's where you can kind of go. And we also think a lot about integrating caves and screens and interfaces into virtual worlds with physical space. So that's a particular personally very, very interest in that, and I think that's something for architects where a lot of it will substitute a large part of the internet. It becomes real time and more engaged also with, particular design with the product itself in 3D. You can collaborate, use it, sketch over it, discuss it. Fashion, automotive, all the design disciplines can be collaborating in the metaverse, exhibiting in the metaverse. But it's more generally, of course, it's all work environments have potentially doing this. Universities, if you want to do online only universities, I think and we've done a lot of conferences in the metaverse where it's different from a Zoom where you have a good of names and oftentimes only remote people, and you don't talk before, in between, and after, and you don't have parallel events you can shift between. So conference in the metaverse, and that is a great task for designers because it's the same. We know what the social event wants to achieve. We know the community of interactions which want to be hosted, platformed, and set up. And these are we have a lot of experience, and we're exploiting the inherent intuitive competence of people to navigate spaces and social settings and situations to join and so on and so forth. So that's a wonderful, I think, world of design opportunity, and will be a great productivity boost for everybody around the world if you can have a much better experience in a remote interaction currently, and nearly as good as maybe a physical interaction with some advantages. But you can save, flying somewhere out, and then you need to, if I'm still flying around sometimes, but to join one kind of session or meeting or conference, you have to give 3 days or 2 days if it's in China or India, and otherwise you can do several events per day in the metaverse. So great. I mean, interior designers, God, yes, you don't have all this political interference on the inside, except for residential.
Patrick, we have a question from a remote participant.
Okay, great.
Sort of summarize and elaborate on a little bit. And I want to point back to what you were saying earlier about China, for example.
Yeah.
So one of the arguments we hear, and you touched on it, about why there will never be a third runway at Heathrow, why it's impossible to build high-speed rail in California, is that there are too many competing and overlapping interest groups, regulators, community associations, and so forth, all of whom have a say, too many competing stakeholders, if you like.
Absolutely.
Whereas in China, you have a more centralized decision-making process, ironically, which can sometimes allow things to be done faster and more quickly. The remote question is also about, okay, in these complicated multi-stakeholder environments, how do you resolve those competing claims, whether it's a simple thing like building height or some kind of external restriction, or whether it's something more complicated that involves cooperation? Who should decide, and how can those decisions be made?
Great question, and I absolutely agree that this in China, this is refreshing that you had a single point of decision making. And by the way, this was also the case when you had the great entrepreneurs doing this. You didn't necessarily, now it's shifted to the government, and the government is doing most of the urban development investments and master planning if they are our clients, and oftentimes actually putting up the real estate to some extent. But before that, we had privates, and they were just they're bidding for a piece of land. They had total freedom. I mean, that's what we should have. Land should be exchanged in the market, and the development rights should not be usurped by the government. They should stay in private hands. That's where they will be most efficiently employed to maximize value, rather than being constrained. And the way the government gets away with constraining everything, because there's so much pressure that they can find always several people still bidding and wanting to do exactly what they prescribe. In other cities where there's people in Istanbul, for instance, they actually can't do that. If they want to prescribe exactly what the government, please build this and nothing but this, then nobody will come. Because the pressure isn't so high, and the kind of it ideally private planning. And I think this is what the way London was developed. There were the large private estates. They actually first started to have urban planning in a modern sense based on certain chunks of London, which were the great landlords, and they were leasing out the land, so they had, and they could sell with certain covenants, and they would plan and regulate a value proposition, making sure that the different functions fit with each other as much as they understood, but they can also look at each other and see what works and adapt that. And because it was leasehold, they could also the land falls back to them, and they can, if they wanted to do something new, they could do that. So that was actually a very healthy model, and the 19th century city, for instance, is still very robust and very functional. And when the 20th century government state-planned urbanization destroyed a lot and is unloved and dysfunctional in the meantime, is oftentimes already wiped out again. Let's say all the work from the 50s, 60s, 70s is defunct and long demolished, whereas the 19th century remains robust. So, and this was private planning and private entrepreneurial initiatives. And that's what we should rely on. And of course, it's true that you have externalities. So the value of a site depends on many other sites, and there could be also quite a bit away. Since we talk knowledge economy, and physical industry is no longer in the center so much. These are kind of robotic machines or data centers or factories. We don't have so much negative externalities. We have more a lot of positive externalities. And I think having substituting the current planning bureaucracy with landowner associations, if they want to regulate somehow collectively, leave it to the larger landowners. And then often what we observed, that smaller landowners can be kind of spoken of and taken care of by the large ones. We had that in Istanbul, for instance, where they had huge parts of a land, former industrial sites converted, and they were forming landowner associations. So these kind of private mechanisms to regulate and also then to synthesize and curate positive externalities, I think that would be the way forward. But I think also quite often, I do think there should be territories in a city where there is totally unregulated, a free for all, anybody coming in doing anything, whatever. Because even that kind of curation through the major real estate, they need to, what do they go by? There needs to be also a raw experimentation and discovery process also. So I believe in a multi kind of tiered system where you have all private. And I think, the problem I have, now you have it democratized, but people don't really pay attention properly. They say, no, I don't want, they don't, nobody has the time and energy to read a proposal, to care about a proposal. Politicians also, local elections, only 30% vote in any event. They don't know. And then you have councillors who are in charge, basically unchecked, follow their hobby horses, or, they're lobbied at in a process which is very discretionary. So this kind of so-called community democracy is anyway totally defunct. And doesn't channel final end user interests, of those who live there, but also particular who might want to join and live there. And I don't think we should always privilege the incumbents within a territory, but also, make space for future people to join, to generate these synergy hubs. They'll be cared for much, much better by developers, because in the end, this monetary value must represent in a proper market economy actually utility, end user value. And of course that will be, nothing is perfect, but they will try to deliver towards this. And if not, they will have losses, and you have a profit and loss system. Of course, the losses, those who have hobby horses and false ideas will be weeded out, and those who deliver to the actual needs will flourish, replenish their investment, and curate a proper city. And to some extent, that was the 19th century. And this kind of deviation into planning is actually only 20th century, and actually only second half of 20th century. So it's only since 1947 that, and in particular the UK, that development rights were nationalized. And since then, you have an explosion in land values, and you have these land value distortions. You know, between an agricultural use and an urban use, it's a kind of factor of 10,000 or something absurd. No, this shouldn't be. A land, so you have a kind of extremely artificial making scarce of developable land, and actually the development rights being 100% nationalized and being handled by bureaucrats who don't also have the capacity. I mean, these applications are not looked at properly. They have a law saying 13 weeks, it's still 64 weeks to get a decision, which is 50% the rejection, and then you keep reapplying. So it is totally dysfunctional and paralyzing, and the negative prosperity effects are totally underestimated because you don't see what isn't there. You don't see the opportunity cost. I have a very strong sense of what these opportunity costs are and what the life could be like, and that all these kind of Grammy bad and conditions and boring conditions in a way for an arm and a leg of the income is really not what should happen. And you can see that in China actually, that you what you can deliver. Of course, as I said, in recent years, it has also been start to be very kind of a bit more regulated. Yeah.
We do have time for one or two more questions. I want to make sure
Okay.
all the students have a chance. Guys, don't be shy. Faculty? Okay, we got one taker in the back there.
I would encourage students to get involved in planning codes in your city. It's the boringest thing you probably could ever go to, but like, that's how this stuff gets established, and people create these rules that become, you know, laws of like how you have to do. So if you want to have more freedom to do your designs, it's not the 10 commandments. These are just rules that local people make up in a lot of cases on certain kinds of codes. So I would think that either through y'all's professional organizations or even just through the local places where you live, a lot of those things may be able to be changed or removed to give people more freedom. But somehow we've let over time planners that seem to think they know what everybody wants in the market need to live instead of letting people pick out for themselves. So I would at least consider that.
Yeah, terrific. Other questions, comments? We have a few more from remote participants, but I'd like to give the in-person attendees a chance. Yes, please.
Hello, Patrick. My name is Patrick as well, so it's good to have you on video today. I just have a very simple question of, do you recommend 3 cities we can travel to where we might see good future living?
That's tough. I mean, actually, you know, there's this kind of thing in London, which is called the City of London. It's the square mile. The old first London in the old city boundary switch. And that is a kind of fluke of historical kind of anachronism, which allowed for something quite spectacular and dynamic to emerge. And I think that the predominance of London as a financial center has to do with this, because this piece of land is been governed on basis of a medieval constitution, literally, because in England you have these kind of anachronisms. It's a bit like a kind of anachronism of the the emergence of Hong Kong as a sleepy backwater. While England was nationalizing everything, Hong Kong was a thriving free marketplace. In the midst of all this kind of planning, the square mile was not had its autonomy. And I'm, by the way, a freeman of the City of London. That is livery societies, basically the business associations who are collectively deciding and determining the policy, and there is really let it rip. And it piles in and it's super dense, and you have new buildings cropping up all the time, and it's a super dynamic skyline. The buildings are the most high value you can imagine, and the city needs this. All these high value in financial institutions, law firms, they're all sitting there. And it's that, I mean, and you still have beautiful alleys and the historical jewels and the Bank of England and medieval and small churches interspersed there. So they also you don't need government to take care of these kind of assets. They become assets. So it's still kind of a government, but they don't have residents. So, and they at some point realized we can't unfortunately allow residents in, because once you have residents in, the NIMBYism and the paralysis will be stopping everything. So that's why we definitely invite you to go and visit, understand that. So it's a shame that they can't have residences, because the residences would have these rights of stoppage. And I think one principle for me is clear. I mean, I'm sitting here and you can get, oftentimes I'm getting, somebody wants to plan something and you're consenting. I never look at it, I don't care, is it really affecting me? No. But then there's enough people who then answer, they're probably all answers are no. We should simply say we don't have any power over somebody else's property, what they're building there, unless it's, pollution and something. That's no longer on the agenda, and you could use common law, as it were, to restrict that. But I think that is the key, and that is in the city, of course, it's regulated by this way. They have a few residents, but the vast majority is businesses, and somehow the businesses, they all understand more, and that they don't restrict each other, and everybody's flourishing can only be good for everybody. And that's where I want to go. And then the other one is Gurgaon, outside Delhi, where you have that kind of vibrant, pure private city. But there was simply a vacuum in terms of planning capacity in some kind of suburban area outside Delhi, where there was simply there was nobody there to prevent, basically, or administer. And so a city sprung up totally without authorities. The only thing which is slightly dysfunctional, let's say, or relatively speaking, each development has its own power generation, canalization, water treatment, and so on. And they now have to maybe stitch this together, but all over India, infrastructure is catastrophic anyway, and they have less outages and problems with water than everywhere else in India. But I would say these two places I could recommend, and the third one I want to recommend is, well, if Honduras Prospera, but it's a very tiny spot where you had this fantastic idea of a type of free economic zone which gave investors not only total freedom in terms of planning, but total freedom in terms of all the other aspects of taxing, of employment law, of import, export, of generating jurisdictions. And these developers, these entrepreneurs, they allow anybody company to bring their own regulatory regime they find useful to work under from anywhere in the world. And unfortunately, it was left government kind of tried to clamp this down, but it still survives. It's a very small nucleus, but if you go there, you get great conversations with the entrepreneurs and their vision of a free city. So I'm part of this kind of free cities movement. There are a few other attempts around the world. There's a free cities. It's basically on Roma's charter cities idea originally, which inspired the legislation in Honduras, because they were so desperate to bring in investment. Also, the central government realized, the president, that the corruption of all the local planners and anybody, they couldn't kind of carve through this. They can't transform the system. So they have to kind of sideline the system and allow a new system to take root, including policing, including security. All they're obliged to uphold in their own way is the criminal law, and they have their own courts. I mean, that's going further, much further, but the slogan here is a free market for living together. And so I look at the Free Cities Institute or Free Cities, yeah, and they have a whole database of all these attempts. Liberland is another one which is struggling, and so we are connected to this. There's another one, Praxis. So we've done sketches and designs for some of these, let's say, call it libertarian startup cities.
Well, that's a great list. So professors, I think we have ideas for some new study abroad trips we need to design for our students. So, Patrick, thanks so much for spending time with us, and thanks to all of you for coming. Let's show our appreciation.
Thank you, thank you.
Well, see you again sometime soon.
See you, yeah, hope to see you soon. Bye.
There's a page to the left, if y'all want to join us.